Well, let's get started tonight with Dan Bowman, teacher of creative writing at Taylor University in Indiana. And the book we are reading tonight and discussing, On the Spectrum, Autism, Faith, and the Gifts of Neurodiversity. I want to thank Dan for joining us tonight. It's a great book. I hope you all had a chance to read it. So as we normally do, I'll start with a prayer, and then Dan can just join in talking about his background, the book, and its inspiration, but I'll start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, as we approach the new year, we feel your power when things like COVID get in our way, when the weather gets in our way. We know we are not in control. We thank you for your ever-loving or your ever-present grace and love that will help us get through this. Thank you for bringing us together via Zoom to talk about this important aspect of the human condition. Amen. So Dan, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, by way of introduction, sometimes I reference the very short essay toward the beginning. If I can find it really quickly. Called Diversity and Dignity on page 46. And what I talk about in that essay, I guess I won't take the time to read it if folks have read the book. Again, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. This is a really wonderful opportunity. I appreciate it. What I talk about a little bit in this essay is when I'm on my journey toward diagnosis and sort of integration and trying to figure out who I am and what my gifts and limitations are going to be when I understand that I'm autistic. I start to do some research and recognize that most of what's out there online about autism and being a professor is about Temple Grandin. And so, which is fine. I like Temple Grandin. Has anyone seen the HBO Temple Grandin movie starring Claire Danes? I really actually like the film a lot. We use it in some classes in the Intro to Autism Studies minor here at Taylor, and I've had a chance to introduce the film and talk about it and things like that. So she has such an interesting legacy and life story. It's very, very compelling. But at the same time, I understood that her narrative took up too much space, perhaps, in the popular imagination when it came to formulations of what autism might look like and what autistic people might choose to pursue with their lives. And what I wasn't seeing were good representations of autistics in the arts, especially. And my whole life has really been defined by literature, creative writing, theater, film, music, and the like. And so I thought, I see a lot of representations going way back to Dustin Hoffman playing Rain Man opposite Tom Cruise in the 80s. You have the kind of the math and numbers savant, and then you have also a very, very scientific mind in Temple Grandin. Where's a space being created for artists on the autism spectrum and people who are storytellers? And so that's kind of where I position myself in the tradition. And I think part of this book was trying to help me make that space. At the very same time, of course, I think it's I don't write nonfiction because I love nonfiction or I love writing memoir. I really don't. It's hard for me to do. I like writing fiction and I like writing poetry. All my training and background is in poetry. I turn to nonfiction when I feel like I have no other choice. And in terms of autism and growth and self-development and self-awareness, I just felt like I had to write this stuff out. I had to tell the story to kind of let go of some of the shame that I've carried around in my life and to heal. And so it's kind of the wounded healer trope where the sort of sacred wound that you sustain, the toughest thing that you go through, could become your greatest source of blessing that you have to offer the world. And so I think those dual impulses to create a space for artistic autistics and to try to just heal from my own trauma in my own life and from my childhood and everything. I think that's probably what led me most to write this book. And I was given a really nice opportunity by Brazos. It was clear that there were folks who were really interested in hearing this, and I'm thankful for that.
Did the in the book you discuss the Autism Minor at Taylor? Did that did that arise from your presence at Taylor?
No, it's coincidental. It's kind of neat because at this point I'm actually fairly involved in that. I mean, all my training and background and academic credentialing is in creative writing. But what's really neat is there's a colleague of mine named Vance Maloney who teaches in the psychology department and runs the Autism Minor. He has become a really good friend, and you don't often see this in evangelical circles, at least in my experience, not to paint with too broad a brush, but you don't often see people who understand the value of relying on the so-called own voices to find a person from a marginalized community and listen to them carefully as you build curriculum on how to teach people how to be with autistic students in elementary schools and high schools and so forth. But Vance really took that up without a lot of prompting from me. And so it's funny how, and in fact, he uses the book as a textbook in the class literally called Intro to Autism Studies. And this was his first time using the book was this spring, because it just came out, or this fall rather, because it just came out in August. So I feel very fortunate that those things kind of came together. Yeah, it wasn't really by design or anything. Yeah.
There's so many fascinating parts of the book. Let's just start at the beginning. You grew up in upstate New York, and the uprooting from going from Mohawk, New York to Indiana is sort of tragicomic. You know, that you're brought over to it's the middle of nowhere, as we sometimes say. Can you describe what that felt like when you were taken out of the area you were most comfortable in and tried to make a new life in a whole new area?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I described that like a comfort object kind of. And if you have an autistic person in your life, or if you're autistic, you'll understand what I mean when I say a comfort object, that old shirt or flannel shirt or blanket or ball cap or something that the autistic person hangs on to well past its intended lifespan, much like Linus in the old Charlie Brown comics with his blanket. And actually, for me, I recognized that place really was a comfort object for me, because I grew up in central New York, went to college out in western New York, and that's what I knew was the foothills of the Adirondacks. I knew the quality of the blue in the sky in the summer, and I knew the wind off of Lake Ontario out in Rochester, and things like that. And so I didn't realize how dependent I was on that kind of structure that provided, the everyday weather experience, provided for me. And I had some signs over the years. I remember many years ago going out to Santa Fe, New Mexico for a writing thing. And it's a beautiful town and it's well celebrated for good reason. But I remember walking around and feeling so dislocated and lonely and scared. And I couldn't put my finger on why. I just couldn't understand what was happening. Everyone else was talking about how great it was and how beautiful it was. But I think I was just being reminded that place is such a comfort object for me. So I make the move out here, and I can't do that without the support or the scaffolding of reading many, many books and short stories and poems by people in the Midwest who are celebrating this particular landscape, and beckoning me to want to understand it better and not just be dismissive of it, like what we have joked about. Um, and instead learn how to embrace it and set up shop here. And it's kind of a Wendell Berry sort of thing, putting down roots and trying to understand the community. And I guess the other side of that too is that I came here for a job. I got a job, at Taylor, and so now I'm halfway through my 11th year of teaching at Taylor. So I've put in more than a decade at this institution, and by and large, I've just had an absolutely wonderful experience here. The students and what I get to do, I get to talk about books and the things I'm passionate about and the things I love, and the mistakes I've made in my own craft. In writing fiction and poetry and nonfiction and so forth, that really made the transition so much easier, because I was coming here for a deep sense of purpose, something that I'm absolutely it's connected to my identity, and in fact I over-identify with my job sometimes.
Instead of just uprooting and finding something new, it helped you be more grounded.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, I had to learn how to love this place. There's this great line by Simone Weil, who is a tough read, but sometimes comes through with great shining clarity. And I picked this up in an essay by Scott Russell Sanders, and I'm pretty sure I quote it in the book somewhere because I'm always quoting this. She says, "Let us love the land of here below. God has willed that it should be difficult yet possible to love it." And so I've thought about that a lot. I've thought, yeah, it's sometimes difficult. I'm in a small town. I don't have the access to the cultural amenities that I like in bigger cities. I would just as soon go to opera or a play or something like that. And I don't have that opportunity very often. So it's difficult yet possible to love it. So I had to figure out, how do I set up shop out here? How do we raise our kids out here, and how's that going to work? So if nothing else, it's made me very reflective and intentional, I think.
And reading the writers of the area, it goes back to how your attraction to literature and the fine arts, because that's how you have, since the autism gave you a deficit of intuitively understanding people, you had to use the books to understand. It's like an owner's manual for other people.
Yeah, and that's something that I think I used to be embarrassed about that, but I share it pretty freely now. I was just talking about that on a podcast not too long ago, a couple of weeks back before the holidays. That really started for me with the 19th century British novels, starting early in that century with Jane Austen, and then going up through the Brontes and George Eliot and some of the others. When I read those in college, because I was kind of a goof in high school, and I write about that in the book. I didn't do a whole lot of reading and a whole lot of work, but I fell in love with literature and storytelling when I was in college, and I recognized the great psychological insight that these writers had into the hearts and minds of other people. And I thought, man, I've taken psychology classes, and I think these writers in the 19th century could have, given Freud and Carl Jung a run for their money. They just intuitively understood what it meant to be human, and what made people tick, and what made people fall in love, and what made people become hateful, and all these things. And so I just gravitated toward it, not knowing that I guess that I lacked a substantial inroad into connecting with other people.
But and also people in community, which is a major theme through your book about your Taylor community, the Christian community, the undergrad community, and all that. So
and so in some ways, in building that community out here, I had to be not just reading, but to your point about community, volunteering at the art center that we built some years back. And so I write about that a little bit, and what that taught me, and how that pulled me into a space where I could meet other kinds of people. I'm I'm very inclined to want to hang out with other writers and other people who are into the arts. They tend to be my best friends. And I struggle with people whose minds work differently and people who put the world together differently from the way that I do. And so when I worked at the Arts Center, we had a registered nurse who works at the local hospital here. We had a former state senator who's a retired politician. We had a school teacher, and some others too. And that was very, very helpful in me building community, because it was centered on the notion of art making people's lives better. And so that attracted me, and then I could find a way into a community with these other folks.
I don't know if this question is relevant or something, but I wanted to ask, has finding a church home and a church style been difficult? Is it you were raised Roman Catholic, and now
Yeah.
you found it's like, if you I'm fascinated by your faith journey and the fast, that side of you, and I'm attracted to high church because it's stable and I don't have to hug a lot of people,
Yeah.
and maybe that you can relate to that.
Yeah.
But you know, in a small town in Indiana, there's so many choices you could take. And how did you find your church home?
Yeah, it's a great question, because you wouldn't expect it. I write in the book about a couple unexpected finds when I got out here. I don't write about my church a whole lot in the book, but I'll talk about it for sure. And the other thing that I found when I got out here was, I remember my last couple sessions of spiritual direction in Rochester, New York. And I said to my spiritual director, well, I guess this era of my life is probably over, because I really don't see, this guy had a doctorate from Princeton Theological Seminary. And I thought to myself, I don't see anybody in this little rural area probably who's going to offer spiritual direction and read the kinds of things that I read about contemplation and mysticism and whatever. And he said, well, you never know. Take a look. You never know. And he sent me the most basic website ever. It was just something like spiritualdirectorsearch.com or something like that. And sure enough, I went on there, and here was this wonderful Roman Catholic retreat center, and a longtime sister of the Poor Handmaidens of Jesus Christ was the order. And I ended up going to spiritual direction with her, and it was a fantastic time, literally right down the street from my house. You wouldn't expect it, but there it was. The same kind of thing happened with my church. We go to church over in Marion, which is a nearby city, very typical Rust Belt small city, kind of an Akron, Ohio, a Marion, Indiana, based on manufacturing, and now all the manufacturing is gone. And so you have a lot of empty factories and empty parking lots. Well, I started going to the church there, having not been to an Episcopal church, just because I knew that the priest was more progressive than any other preacher at any other church in the area. And in fact, the churches that most of my evangelical colleagues go to, I visited some of them, and I heard things that really bothered me and upset me, and I wasn't willing to take my kids into those spaces. I didn't think that they were safe. So it was, we landed there because I thought it was a match for my journey theologically, but then it also, to your point, Jim, it also became a match for me liturgically, and that was really super interesting to me. I went, and that took a long time to sink in. I went for years, and I went through the whole liturgy and the sung liturgy and the Eucharist and everything that we do, the kneeling and the crossing yourself, etc. Not thinking too much of it, and then recognizing after a couple of years that it had taken a deep hold on my spirit, and that I loved it, and that I valued it, and it did bring me comfort. And so it just happens to be a perfect match for me. Now we have a younger, Father Jim retired, and we have a younger priest, and she's absolutely phenomenal. She's probably the best preacher I've ever sat under. And so I'm very, very thankful to live in an area where you wouldn't expect to get that. And yet the kinds of books you all are reading in groups like this is on my, priest's reading list. And that's what I like to hear from the pulpit. So it's pretty great, actually.
You, in my reading about autism through the years, I was always uncomfortable with the term high functioning and low functioning, even though it's handy and it is itself functional. But in the book, you mentioned, you said that's a better term would be needing outside support. So there's people who need more support and less support. And that's such a much better, more clear, because some people are so good, because the range of spectrum is a spectrum. So many people are different and good at so many different things. But then you also mentioned that people on the spectrum, that you feel a kinship and a responsibility for people who need a lot of outside support, which I think was a great manifestation of Christian responsibility, in that it's we are all Christ's children and God's children, and it's impossible to turn your back on people who need a lot of support, and it's impossible for us to turn our back on someone like you who's neurologically different. And I thought that was a brave and wonderful thing to say.
Thank you. That's it's a tough thing. The functioning labels thing, in a sense, is just very practical, because obviously they're convenient labels when you're just simply trying to have a conversation and you need to supply some vocabulary. But at the same time, they do tend to crumble under a little bit of scrutiny or a little bit of pressure, because I'm sure I say this somewhere in the book, but a so-called high functioning autistic like myself can become low functioning in a matter of minutes, so to speak. I mean, if you surprise me with something that I'm not expecting, or take away the structure that I need, or I get overwhelmed, or just all the normal things, I won't be functioning so well, and that will be apparent to everybody in the room. And so it does kind of fall apart in that sense. In terms of responsibility to the autistic community, especially, I still find it very, very interesting that the most recent iteration of the DSM, which I think was 2013 when it came out, folded what was once called Asperger's syndrome into the greater autism spectrum. And when those researchers and doctors and clinicians and whoever is on the board of directors for that, manual, when they did that, they made a really radical decision that said to somebody like me, you're related to the nonverbal autistic child who rocks back and forth and hasn't, used language to communicate yet. And I thought to myself, well, okay, but what am I gonna do about that, and how do I feel about that? I'm not sure what to do, and I still don't know what to make of it. And I've tried to be very honest, because you get online and there are people in discussions and they're saying, well, yeah, sure, you can write books and do all this stuff. My kid can't go to the bathroom alone, so you don't speak for all autistics. And I'm never trying to. But I do feel a sense of kinship and responsibility, and I want that to be an area where I can grow in the coming years. I hope that my experience in some way, although it's unique to me, can be useful to other people on the spectrum.
And to people who are just understanding the spectrum. I loved your metaphor about the motorcycle ride, about how that's, and something I had never realized before, that your depth of experience, your depth of feeling in the moment is something that can throw you off with a meltdown. And I had never perceived it that way, that you were so into the things around you that changing those is frightening and chaotic.
Yeah. I was just talking about this with somebody recently. Somebody had asked me, what do you think are what are the first traits and characteristics that come to mind when you think about being autistic? And I said, most people, especially people who are not autistic, who are neurotypical, will make a big deal about eye contact and or social mannerisms and some awkwardness and things like that, and say, well, unable to reciprocate, normal banter with other people and so forth, all that kind of stuff. I actually don't think of that at all. It's not the first thing at all that occurs to me. What occurs to me first about being autistic is sensory processing disorder. And so when I use that motorcycle metaphor, and for those of you, if you haven't read it or need a reminder, it's essentially just saying, like, I think there's some connection perhaps to, if you're driving in a regular car down the road, you're not really participating in that environment all that much. You're shielded from it, quite literally, and you can even control the temperature within your vehicle. And if you hit a little rock or stone, it's not really going to throw you off all that much. Being autistic is like riding a motorcycle. You're out there and the elements are there. And if a wasp wants to fly into your face, it's gonna, and you better be prepared. And you've got to be working the clutch and the gas and both feet and both hands and everything. And it's a very deeply immersive experience. And that's how I feel all the time with sensory processing disorder. I have to just be on the lookout all the time if the sun is too bright and it's in my eyes, or something's irritating me. If the room is too warm, it's tough because my wife is always cold. I'm always too hot. So we're always having these battles about the heat in the house. But those are real, elements that can overwhelm my senses very easily.
And keeping on the road and keeping straight, it's a balancing act at all times, but it's beautiful too. You talk about the trees and the birds and the fields that you're driving through.
Yeah.
Right? And your deep connection.
Right. And I do think there's something to be said for that. That side of the metaphor is that for me, like as a poet, it really comes in handy. If I notice, the time of year when the Osage oranges fall onto the road from the heavy bough above, I have some images that I can use in my poetry all of a sudden, and that's good for me because I think poetry is about noticing and observing and all that kind of stuff. So it is helpful to have that sort of sharp eye and sharp sensory experience in many ways, but it's a blessing and a curse,
I think I'll open the floor to questions from anybody who's in the chat. Alan, do you want to? Alan put his hand up.
Unmute. It kind of relates to where we're just talking about now. I just thank you so much for the section of the book, page 64, 65, and so on, the pathology versus the neurodiversity. That was awesome because it was interesting. I was reading through, you common symptoms, you were talking about some of them, and I was reading through, and it doesn't seem so problematic. It seems fine to me. But then when I read about you've got it from somebody else, but what is NT syndrome? I love that because then I got it. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. Am I preoccupied with social concerns, delusions of superiority, and obsession with conformity? I just love that section because that's what brought it home to me. I didn't see how damaging that pathology model was until I read that, neurotypical write-up written in a pathology language. So just thank you for that. That to me was worth the price of the book right there.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that too. And I was just I got a message from somebody the other day who a stranger to me, but he follows me on one of the social media platforms. And he was saying, I have to give a presentation about autism. What's like one thing that you would say to include for people who aren't super familiar with all of it? And I said, maybe you want to start with the pathology paradigm versus the neurodiversity model and that shift in paradigm, because if you think about it, boy, think of little school children who, have those symptoms and characteristics put upon them, and the language that's used is all about how weird they are and what oddballs they are, and that's going to cause shame. That literally makes people suicidal when they think that they're such aliens. And instead, if we just say it's just a different brain wiring, it has its pluses actually. Sometimes when I hear discussions on, eugenics and things like that, I think to myself, be careful what you wish for, because I don't think you want to eliminate autistic people from the population, because we're problem solving and we're making art and we're doing relationship in a maybe a strange way, but a unique and interesting way. So yeah, I'm really glad that resonated. Thanks for bringing that up.
That was just the whole typical for us. That's what a lot, because I could imagine the hurt that those symptomatic language could cause, but it didn't strike me as how viscerally bad it was until I read the neurotypical. So that, just closing on that loop was just beautiful. I thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I started by reading, when I started the research for this, I knew it wouldn't be enough just to write a memoir and tell my own story. I knew I'd have to do some research. Now I'm not a scholar, and so I knew my research would be stuff written for a popular audience. Well, most of what I found written for a popular audience, books like Tony Atwood's The Complete Guide to Asperger's Syndrome from some years back, that is just drowning in the pathology language. And I had such a hard time because I had these dual impulses. I was learning so much about myself from it because he's a good researcher and a good thinker and a good writer. But I also hated the way that he talked about me and people like me, because I thought, man, this guy really thinks we are less than, and it's pretty obvious on every page. So we got to do something about that.
Jana, you had a question.
Thank you, Jim. It's Jana. I appreciate, Dan, what you're saying about a minute ago about sensory processing with the motorcycle analogy, and you talked somewhat in the book about finding a church home where you are comfortable on a sensory level. I'm wondering, I suspect we all, I don't go to Fourth Church, I go to a church in Hyde Park, but I suspect we all have more folks with neurodiversity around us than we realize, especially because many adults are not diagnosed or come to the diagnosis later like you do. I'm wondering how churches specifically can become more comfortable spaces for people who are neurodiverse or more sensitive to neurodiversity, just even in terms of like music and texture and conversation and expectations of coffee hour, just on a very pragmatic level. And I want to also acknowledge the point that you make in the book about how everyone on the spectrum is different. So if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So I'm not trying to sort of lump everybody together, but if you could speak to that, that would be great.
That's a wonderful thought. Thank you for that. It is so tricky because some autistics are sensory avoidant because they get overwhelmed so easily. Some autistics are sensory seeking because they need the stimulation. And so I might find somebody who's on the spectrum who says, yeah, I go to the local vineyard with 3,000 people at a Sunday service and a rock and roll band on the stage, and I love it. If that works for them, that's great. I've been in those scenarios. I can't really do them. Mostly the noise and the lighting is going to hurt a lot of autistic people in general. And I think, not to be self-serving, but I think that the one thing I would probably say for starters, for how the church can maybe do better with neurodivergent people is simply to read first-person narratives by autistic writers and by other neurodivergent writers. I think that can be really useful. I found a lot of solidarity with those folks, of course, myself, but I also just learn well when something is written, like I said earlier, own voices, someone from a disenfranchised or marginalized community telling the story of their own lived experience. So I often say, if Oh, well, here's an example. I was just home for Christmas. I still call it home in upstate New York. They had a new family just moved in across from my in-laws, and my father-in-law is a very friendly guy and a wonderful neighbor to everybody in the neighborhood. Well, these folks are Bosnian and Muslim. And so he did a little bit of research to try to figure out what it is that I could bring over to their door when I knock on the door that would be useful to them. And so I think like that, why not do the research and find out where folks are from, what they like, what they need, and what their lived experience looks like a little bit, and then try to meet them where they are. I think that's more loving than just kind of throwing a blanket up and saying, this is church, love it or leave it. So if we can read first person accounts from people from other countries or immigrants or people on the autism spectrum or anything, I think it just helps us learn how to love our neighbors better, no matter who they are.
Sylvia?
Thank you for joining us tonight. One of the sentences you wrote has probably nothing to do with your background, but will forever stay with me. And it said, there's no shortcut to what we did, to the work we need to do to love our neighbors. That's powerful for me. And so thank you. It will impact so many areas of my life. And the other way it makes a difference for me is that my husband grew up in Kokomo, and it could have been in any city in so many areas of the country. But as a bride, I went there with him, and I was disgusted. Never, openly to his parents, but oh my goodness, I wish I could go back and do that and see a new space through the way that you helped us see it. And so thank you for so much.
Thank you. Both of those comments are very, very meaningful to me. I appreciate that so much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And I'm talking to myself when I say those things mostly. I say there's no shortcuts. I have to remember that every day. There are students that I teach who are LGBTQ. They're from different countries. They grew up with a lot of money. They grew up with no money. And I have to try to understand each and every person as an individual and try to see them the way that God would see them. And yeah, there's no shortcuts to that. It takes a lifetime to even get started on that. But yeah, so I'm preaching to myself when I say those things. But same with looking at the landscape of a rural town in Indiana or something. I just knew in my poet's heart that there had to be something special, and I could find it if I did my homework and if I entered into community and took it seriously. And I'd have a lot more fun too. And so that's what I was trying to do, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There is a rich literary tradition in Indiana that we often overlook.
Yeah, there is, and there are a lot of contemporary writers here too, which was exciting when I first moved here. I got to meet the poet laureate of Indiana. It's a 2-year post usually for a state poet laureate, and so I've met a number of them actually. And then they asked me to be on the governing board that elects the poet laureates at one point a couple of years back. So I got to kind of really get steeped in the Indiana literary community, which was fun. Down in Bloomington especially, boy, they've got high-powered writers, some really excellent people. Yeah. But it does go back to Booth Tarkington of Indianapolis. I mean, won the Pulitzer Prize for literature, so that's something.
One of the most moving sections to me was at the very end when you talk about the SEND program, and it's students engaged in neurodiversity or encountering neurodiversity.
Students for education on neurodiversity. So yeah, yep.
Can you describe how that evolved and I just love the different reactions from different students
Yeah,
to it all.
it's moving to me too, and it still is. It's just been a wonderful thing. I got a text from a good friend last night who lives in Salt Lake City, and she said, I just got to the end of your book and you couldn't have picked a better ending than to let the kids speak, you know? And I was hoping that that would work. And what I told her, I texted her back and I said, to be honest, when I first encountered the Send group, I conceived of that as the ending of the book, but that was before I ever interviewed any of them. So I knew in my heart that they would say very beautiful and profound things. I didn't know what those things were yet, but they did, I think. They really did. So the Send group came about because when I was writing this book and I was publishing some essays about being autistic and being a Christian, and being an artist and all these intersecting identities, I thought, I know there are kids right here on this campus who are on the spectrum as well. I want to find them and see if I can help them and be a mentor, because I guarantee they're struggling. If they're ADHD, for example, also, they're struggling with time management and getting their homework done, and they're getting obsessed with their special interests when they ought to be doing their, writing an essay for some class or whatever. So they're probably having a hard time. I want to see if I can help them. And I reached out to some students on Twitter and said, I'd like to start a club, like a new group for autistic students, if anybody would want to be part of it. And I'll just see what happens. Maybe it won't go anywhere, maybe it will. And a student wrote me back and said, we already kind of started one and we're not really official yet, but we kind of have this thing going. We've had a couple meetings. Do you want to come and hang out with us? And I was like, yeah, of course I do. So I started going, and soon after they asked me to be the faculty advisor to the group. I helped them write up the charter and to get approved for official club status so that we could have a budget from the university and all that kind of stuff. So we made a bunch of really good steps. Those meetings are amazing. I'm very, very tired at night and I don't want to go back to campus after I've been there all day doing stuff. But an evening meeting with the Send group, I'll leave there feeling refreshed, even if I'm really tired, because they just tell their stories, and they're wonderful stories. And like, if you read even just the tiny excerpts that I put in the book, you get a little flavor of the way that they put the world together. And I keep saying, the kids are all right. The future might be in good hands because they're very sharp about who they are and how to treat each other and things like that. Things that I never knew when I was that age.
And it's, how often does that meet them?
Usually in a regular semester, it's usually twice a month. So it's every other week. Yeah, and it's about an hour. Different people have run it differently. We had a president last year. She graduated. She used to get more guest speakers and things like that. The president this year is more, it's kind of more organic. He's having students, kind of tapping student talent to come in and tell their stories. And that's actually been really great too, because it serves the dual purpose of kind of edifying us and teaching us, but also bringing more numbers to the group, because a lot of times they end up joining the club. So it's been really cool. I just think, boy, if you're going to talk about Christian education or a Christian college and dare to use that word as an adjective, I think you got to provide places where people can be their true selves and can feel safe to learn and grow. And so for me, it's just a really necessary and good thing.
It also teaches advocacy for the people.
Yeah. And I find that they're more comfortable. Today's 19 or 20-year-old, they seem more comfortable in that realm than I ever have. I don't really think of myself as an advocate. I think of myself as a writer. But they're pretty good at speaking up and getting what they need, and they empower each other to do that. And I do hope, I I do hope that when they see a professor who's autistic and is writing books and raising a family and just doing the normal stuff, but you know, following his dreams and having some professional success, I hope that that does inspire them, because some of them were told, their parents were told when they were 4 years old that they may have to be institutionalized or something, you know, because there's so much misunderstanding around autism. But many of them are thriving. And so I hope to be a good model for them.
Sylvia, question?
A friend today asked me if I was hopeful for 2022. Are you hopeful? Do you think your students are hopeful?
I am hopeful. Yeah. Boy, it takes a lot to make me feel really cynical for an extended period of time. I'm just kind of naively hopeful. Autistics have sometimes been described as childlike, you know. I do get a sense of that for myself. I'm a little bit naively hopeful sometimes, because I can see a lot of good even despite the tough things that are happening. In a really practical sense, just listening to a physician on NPR the other day saying, I think we're turning a corner, you know, on some COVID things and some important ways and stuff. I thought, boy, it's nice to hear that. I hope it's true. It's been so hard and it's been so traumatic. I'm hopeful for the students, and I see them as being hopeful. What's tough is I hope that they can find ways to live their most authentic lives and also pay the bills. I don't know what kind of job markets they're going to be looking at and everything, that sort of stuff on the practical side. But like I was saying about the SEND group, my English majors, I mean, I'm really biased toward them, of course, but they are so sharp. They're so smart and they're so self-aware. And I think the ways that they banter and talk to each other and the things that they say, it really betray us just a really sharp intellect. And so I think they understand things well. They still value the arts, even in an age of technology. I see them sitting down reading print books because they prefer it over reading on their phone and so forth. I see hope in little gestures like that, I think. Yeah. But also I in the greater sense, I obviously subscribe to a master narrative of hope and of redemption. And so that informs the way that I think about most things, I guess. Yeah.
I love the way you point out about making culture and making art. I must pray for strength, but also for inner peace. The same peace I pray for the people in my town who will know when to visit the art center. I think of Ephesians and wonder if it could be a sort of life verse for autistics. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is from the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. So it's the not by works part of it.
Yeah.
You bring so many threads together in this book. I'm so glad we chose it for this discussion.
Oh, I'm so honored. I'm really grateful. I don't know really how to be an author and do these sorts of events and stuff. This is all pretty new to me because my first book was a book of poetry, and Americans typically don't buy or read a lot of poetry. And so I don't have this experience yet, but these kinds of events have just been so, speaking of having hope, I mean, I see a group of folks at a church in Chicago reading wonderful books, reading about the 1619 Project and all these other things, and having some interest in autism. And I see Rachel Held Evans' name come up. God bless her memory. And she was a friend. And so I feel hope in all of that stuff. And I feel excited to do these things. I feel like I'm learning more and more every time. I've done a number of podcasts now and different kinds of talks about the book. And I'm just thrilled to meet people and talk about this stuff. It's so exciting to me. So I'm really honored to be here.
Well, thank you. We're very honored to have you here. And being a teacher does help you with the gift of gab a little bit. So
yeah, That's my
That's a
best
plus.
shot, is that, I had to, unlike many autistics, I went into a sink or swim profession where, if I was going to teach, I was standing in front of a room of people. I had to learn how to do it no matter what. And so I'm grateful for that, though, because I wanted to. I don't blame folks who spend more time alone. It's okay. Everybody's different. But I like this kind of stuff a lot. It's really important to me.
Does anybody else have any other things to say or questions? Then I will thank Dan for joining us and writing such a marvelous book. There was many memorable passages to it that I'll carry for a long time, and think we all agree. So
I would like to say, I didn't get my unmute quick enough, Jim, but I just want to really thank you for your courage, because so often people stay closeted in a lot of ways in their lives, and
Yeah.
to be able to be so forthcoming and with such a beautiful witness, I would say, to the person that you are, is just, it's a powerful, powerful thing. The authenticity and the courage are really, really pretty remarkable. And
Thank you so much for
we
that.
all walk in your shoes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that. That's something that it took me a long time to learn. But when I teach creative writing, I teach students, hey, if you're going to write good nonfiction about your own life, it is not going to work unless you're absolutely vulnerable. And you've got to tell on yourself and show the bad things too. And so I couldn't possibly go out in the world and not do that. So I was afraid that people might, I don't know, look down upon me for it. But it turns out a lot of people have appreciated that. And it's something that has taught me a lot, for sure. So thanks for that. I appreciate that so much.
And your discussion early on in the book, when you came out in front of your colleagues and your peers, was just like frightening.
That was a tough one. I still remember that day.
Yeah.
And what I remember about that day, I'll leave you on a terrible but very autistic image. What I remember about that day is I had a suit jacket on, a suit coat, and a button-up shirt underneath it, and I sweat all the way through the suit coat. I was so nervous, and I had to have it dry cleaned. I was just a mess.
That's great. That's great. Been there.
Oh, thank you, Dan. It's been great to have you. We greatly appreciate these insights.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be here.
Blessings on the semester coming up.
Thank you. Appreciate
The rest
it.
of the year.
Thanks.
Blessings.
Bye, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Night.